Man Whose Nose Was Too Big by Alan Hillery. The street lights spewed their muffled glow into the London fog as the taxi threaded its way through the traffic and lurched to a halt by the pavement. Outside the pilloried entrance to the Cardinal Club, a commissionaire emerged from the evening gloom and, pulling open the car door, offered his hand to extricate me from the horsehair interior. I gratefully accepted, and after paying the driver, allowed myself to be ushered into the cloistered interior of the city's most exclusive club. Upon passing through the foyer, a hand took my cloak and hat, and I was shown to a corner of the main room, where stood a small table flanked by two imposing winged armchairs. Seating myself in one of them, I pulled from my pocket the telegram I had received that morning, and read it for the 10th time. Meet me, 8 p.m., Cardinal Club, Gorman. The Gorman in question was Sir Miles Gorman, a British diplomat, recently returned from Mombasala, the largest of the colonies held by Britain in Africa, and a lifelong friend and companion of the late General Randolph Loki, British High Commissioner to the Mombasalian territories. Loki had died some 2 months previously, and due to the fact that his death had occurred while on duty, it had received scant attention from the British press. Indeed, my own paper, the Metropolitan Evening Standard, had missed it altogether and had been forced to confine itself to covering the arrival and subsequent burial of the body in St. John's Cemetery, Islington. The events had been normal in every way, save for two unusual factors. First, nobody in England had been able to ascertain the cause of death, and second, the body had arrived in London in a sealed, lined coffin with strict instructions that it was to remain unopened. Consequently, no one but the doctors in the Cape Town hospital in which he died had viewed the General's last remains. These circumstances did not escape comment, but had not caused anyone to probe too deeply, as death is a private thing, and none of my press colleagues, myself included, had felt inclined to trouble the next of kin with questions which may have proved distressing. In any event, when a corpse is transported long distances for burial, it is common practice for it to be sealed in a casket to prevent decay of the body tissues, and, in addition, it was widely known for some months prior to his death Loki had been involved in a motor accident. It was thus presumed that death had resulted from injuries sustained at that time, and the unopened coffin was attributed to the fact that the heat of Africa had necessitated immediate embalming, with the resultant need to keep the body from exposure to air. Thus, the questions had remained unanswered, and, as the days passed into weeks, the death of General Randolph Loki gave way to more pressing news, and the subject was forgotten. But not by me. Call it intuition if you like, or just a newsman's nose for a story, but in my own mind I was far from convinced that everything was as it appeared. To begin with, almost 8 months had elapsed between the date of the alleged car accident and the General's death, 8 months during which time he had been back at his work, apparently fully recovered. Also, a veiled rumour had it that he had spent some time in mental institutions during those 8 months, but again returned to work with no obvious ill effects. The pieces of the puzzle just didn't fit. There was something missing, a common link to the unrelated incidents, my suspicions were aroused further. When I began making inquiries, people in the Foreign Office who could have helped me always seemed to be unavailable. Doctors in the South African hospital did not wish to discuss the matter. Even the family found it too upsetting to talk about. Frustration welled up inside me. All my senses told me that I was on the threshold of an outstanding story. And yet there seemed to be nobody willing to open the door. I was almost ready to abandon my attempts when Sir Miles Gorman arrived in London. Gorman had spent the greater part of his 60 years in the diplomatic service, the latter 23 of these in the British Embassy in Mombasala. During this time he and Loki had become close friends and constant companions, and I felt that he, if anyone, would hold the key which would unlock the mysteries of my story. My initial overtures were greeted with the same guarded suspicion that I had come to know so well. I never managed to get beyond his secretary. He always seemed to be out of town, or in conference, or indisposed. I was now convinced beyond doubt that Loki's death had not been from natural causes, and yet I seemed unable to find anyone who would help me. I appeared to be fighting for a lost cause when, one morning, a telegram arrived at my office. It was from Sir Miles Gorman, and it was this telegram that I now held in my hand as I sat in the winged arm-chair in the main room of the Cardinal Club. My thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of 2 large whisky and sodas, accompanied by a tall, elderly man with grey thinning hair, beetling eyebrows, and a large waxed moustache. He was wearing a black dinner suit, white shirt and bow tie, and immaculate black patent leather shoes. As I rose to greet him, I knew instinctively that this was Sir Miles, and that at last my search for the truth was at an end. He shook me warmly by the hand, and lowered himself with a tired, almost relieved sigh into the chair opposite me. "Well, young man," he began, "you're prompt, I'll say that for you. 8 o'clock, I said, and 8 o'clock it is. Now, what is it that's so important?" "It's about General Randolph Loki," I said, looking him directly in the eye. "There are certain aspects of his illness and death which are, to say the least, suspicious. You were his close friend during the last years of his life, and if, as I believe, all was not as it appeared, you will be the most likely person to know what really happened." He stiffened momentarily at my words, and a troubled look came into his eyes. "And what," he said defensively, "leads you to assume that the General's unfortunate death was in any way unnatural? Surely you newspaper people received full reports from Cape Town." "Reports, yes," I replied. "Details, no. It may interest you to learn, Sir Miles, that not one newspaper in this country was able to find the exact cause of death." "Brain damage," he said quickly. "Damage to the lower cells of the brain. You must have known that he was involved in a motor accident. He died from his injuries." 8 months afterwards?" I queried. 8 months during which time he was back at work at the embassy, obviously fully recovered. Come, Sir Miles, I know it to be true that within days of the accident he was addressing tribal councils and making a tour of the territories." He made no reply, but passed his hand wearily over his brow. "Also," I continued, "I understand that later the General received treatment in a hospital and still managed to recover sufficiently to take up his duties again before he died. I ask you, sir, can you in all honesty expect any clear-thinking individual to believe that, despite the circumstances, Loki's death was a normal one?" Gorman sat patiently contemplating his now empty glass. It was as though some private feud was taking place behind the hard blue eyes, almost as if the forces of good and evil were fighting their last battle within his mind. When at last he spoke, it was in a voice which trembled with emotion. "You're right, of course," he nodded. "I guessed what was wrong when you began hounding me. I knew the longer I eluded you, the more your suspicions would be aroused. In any case, someone should know. It's too much to have inside one, to know and to be unable to tell." His voice took on a new gravity. "Young man, you are about to hear a story so strange, so horrible, so unbelievable, that it defies human comprehension, a story of such suffering that the mind of man balks at its understanding, the story of the last months in the life of General Randolph Loki." I felt my heartbeat quicken in anticipation as, with newly charged glass and glowing cigar, Sir Miles Gorman began his tale. "It began almost 11 months ago. It was a Saturday evening, and Loki and myself had enjoyed dinner at the home of one of the junior embassy officials. After dining, we retired to the veranda for coffee, where we fell to discussing the various affairs affecting the corner of the world which was our responsibility. As happens on such occasions, the wine and conversation which flowed erased time from our minds, and it was not until the small hours of Sunday morning that we finally took leave of our host and made ready for our journey home. Loki, who had drunk rather more than he should, was clearly in no fit state to drive himself, and so I offered to take him home in my own car before going on to my residence. The General, however, was quite adamant about his capabilities, and insisted that he should drive himself. As a compromise, therefore, we agreed that he should go on ahead, while I brought up the rear, to be on hand should any obstacles appear on the road, as was quite usual in that rather desolate corner of Africa. Sir Miles paused and sipped his whisky before continuing. "We had travelled some 20 miles without seeing a sign of life, when suddenly, for a reason that eludes me to this day, Loki's car swerved violently, left the road, and came to rest with the bonnet nestling against a tree. I can only presume that some animal had wandered onto the road, or else the excess of wine had caused him to lose control." "So there was an accident," I interjected. "At least that part of the story was true." "Oh, yes," he nodded. "He crashed his car, certainly, and for a time it looked fairly serious. When I got to him, he was slumped over the wheel, unconscious, obviously, having struck his forehead. Anyway, I carried him to my car, and as the nearest hospital was almost 100 miles away, I took him to a small medical station in a nearby village. You know the sort of thing. 2 or 3 beds and 1 doctor. The doctor examined him and found no broken bones, but as he was still deeply unconscious, we decided it would be safer to leave him there until he came round. As I could be of no further assistance, I made my way home and fell into a fitful sleep. My work took me out of the district for the next few days, so I was unable to check on his condition, and it was not until the following Friday that I returned to my office in the embassy. You can imagine, therefore, that I was more than somewhat surprised to find Loki back at his desk, with nothing more to show for his mishap than a small bump on his head. "A remarkable recovery," I murmured. Sir Miles nodded in agreement. "Yes, indeed. It appears that the concussion lasted only 2 days, and as there were no other injuries, the doctor, after a further day's observation, felt fit to allow his patient to leave, and within a week all traces of the accident had disappeared, and the matter was forgotten." Gorman paused, as further supplies of whisky were laid before us. He took a sip and continued. It was about 3 weeks later that Loki first began to complain of severe headaches, the source of the pain being located just behind the left eye. At first he took little heed of this, reasoning that overwork was the cause. But as time went by, they became progressively worse, until eventually, when in the throes of such an attack, his screams of agony could be heard throughout the embassy corridors. As though this condition were not sufficiently bad, he began to faint away at his work, and on these occasions medical help was necessary to restore him. Obviously, this state of affairs could not continue, and so he was ordered to rest at home with daily visits from his doctor. "It appears his brain must have received some damage in the accident," I said, something which had not been apparent at the time. "This was the assumption with which the doctor worked," replied Sir Miles. "But as I visited him each day, it became obvious that his state of health was deteriorating rapidly. He was losing weight too quickly. He took on a grey, pallid complexion, and the pains in his head, once spasmodic, were now with him continually, until such time that no amount of sedation from his doctor could bring relief." "He must have suffered terribly," I murmured, almost to myself. "He did indeed," replied Sir Miles gravely. "But the suffering he experienced at this time was nothing compared to that which lay in store for him." "So what happened next?" "Well, it became increasingly apparent that his condition was becoming ever more grave, so it was decided to move him to a hospital in Cape Town." "The mental hospital, you mean?" He shook his head. "Not at this stage, no. The purpose was to carry out an exploratory operation on the brain in an endeavour to locate the supposed damage suffered in the accident. Anyway, he was taken to the hospital and held under observation for a few days, while various tests were carried out in an attempt to avert surgery. Needless to say, all these proved negative, and the only recourse left to the doctors was to open the skull and examine the brain first-hand. I sought permission from the surgeon to observe the operation, and in view of my close friendship with Loki, this was granted. Upon the appointed day, I seated myself in the observation chamber adjacent to the operating theatre, and watched with bated breath as the inert form of my friend was wheeled in and laid on the table. It was as though I looked upon a stranger. The eyes, once clear and bright, were dark hollows, sunken deep into the head, and the frail body, wasted almost beyond recognition, with shiny grey skin stretched tautly over the framework of bones, whilst his head, shaved clean for the forthcoming operation, gleamed beneath the lights. With deft fingers, the surgeon traced a faint line about 5 inches above the eyes, and, as I watched in horror, he took a saw, and as though he were a carpenter sawing wood, he laid it gently across the line, and holding the head steady with one hand, forced the saw down, causing the sharp teeth to bite into the skull. That sound, young man, will live with me until the end of my days. And yet even this was not sufficient to prepare me for what was to follow. For 1 hour the surgeon probed and examined the now exposed brain, and found nothing. Everything was normal. Nothing appeared out of place. With a resigned gesture he turned to me, and as he did so, the silence of the room was shattered by a piercing scream. All eyes turned to the young nurse, whose trembling hand was pointing to the bloody sponge which was Loki's head. "There's something there," she whispered. "It moved! It moved!" In a flash, the surgeon was bending over Loki, feverishly searching for the object which the nurse had seen, and I felt my stomach turn as he withdrew his hand, holding in the forceps what at first appeared to be a writhing clot of blood, which he shook gently. Then 6 waving legs became apparent. 6 hairy legs attached to a small, bloated body. It was a spider. I recoiled in horror at his words. A spider? I gasped. In his head? Sir Miles nodded. Yes, a spider. It seems that during his stay at the medical station, and while he was still suffering from concussion, the spider, in its search for warmth during the cold African night, had crawled onto his face and up his nose, there burrowing deep into the delicate membranes. Loki, of course, being unconscious, felt nothing, the pain he subsequently suffered being due to the spider slowly eating its way into his head. And he died. On the contrary, once the source of trouble had been removed, he made a rapid recovery, and within a few months, although he was still weak, he was able to return to work. And then all seemed to be well at first. He gradually put on weight and was able to enjoy much of his old life. The worst seemed to be over. He never knew the truth, of course. That would have been too much for him. Anyway, he seemed to be fully recovered when suddenly, within the space of a week, the pains returned threefold. The skin again took on the grey sheen, and this time, worst of all, he went blind and had a complete mental breakdown. I felt my skin crawl. Good God, I said quietly, not another spider. Sir Miles looked up at me for a long time before he answered. And when he did, it was in a voice drawn with tension. No, young man, he said, not another spider. As I have said, Loki's mind snapped, and there was no alternative but to remove him to an asylum. At first I visited him regularly, but it was hopeless. His sightless eyes saw nothing. His deranged mind was unable to function. Gradually, the man was reduced to a vegetable, and it became clear that the end was close. The doctor who had performed the original operation was called in, and he agreed that Loki's only chance of survival lay in a further operation, his opinion being that the spider must have caused irreparable damage to the brain during its stay in Loki's head, damage which may have been overlooked amid the shock which had been present at the first operation. A date was set, and once again I watched numbly as my colleague was laid upon the slab beneath the harsh glare of the lamps. Once more I heard the sickening crunch of the steel teeth as the saw bit into his head. His macabre preliminaries completed, the surgeon laid aside the saw and prized open the skull. Suddenly he recoiled with a cry of disgust. There, completely embedded in the frontal lobe of Loki's brain, was a moving, crawling, festering mass of tiny legs and bodies. Spiders scuttled everywhere, some running 2 by 2 as if performing some ghastly dance, some with eggs upon their backs, fleeing from the glare into some darkened crevice inside the wretched general's head. The surgeon hurriedly flicked away several blood-spattered specimens which had succeeded in crawling onto his hand and arm, and reeled back from the table. "You mean," I asked in horror, "all these spiders had gained entry through the nose?" He shook his head. "No," he replied. "The truth of the matter is that the original spider had belonged to a species which had a particularly short gestation period, and what no one could have known was that it was a female, and found time to lay her eggs whilst living in Loki's brain. These eggs had hatched in the warmth, and it was this that led to the second batch being born in his brain cells, which in turn they devoured in their efforts to stay alive. And the general? Mercifully, he died without regaining consciousness. Of course, the true story was never told. After all, who would have believed it? The following morning, I took the bus to Islington, and my steps led me to St. John's Cemetery. I had little difficulty in locating my goal, and soon I was standing beside the grave of General Randolph Loki. I let my thoughts wander to the occupant of the coffin lying beneath my feet. What suffering that wretched soul must have felt! What anguish! What pain! What agony before death ran down the final curtain on the entire ghastly charade. As I stood there, lost in my thoughts, something moved, and I watched in fascinated horror as two small bloated spiders emerged from the wet earth of the grave and, crawling away, were lost in the grass. I felt my senses reel as I leaned against the headstone for support, and, bending quickly over the cold, damp slab, I was violently sick.